This video is brought to you by HalloCasa. Our tool transforms independent local real estate agents to global real estate agents. Create your own profile for free and get contacted by international investors. Sign up with the link in the description. Hello and welcome everyone to our 198th session of HalloCasa. My name is Mike and today I'm talking to Trevor Koot, CEO of the BC Real Estate Association and host of the podcast Business is Fucking Hard, and a passionate advocate for change management in our industry. With an MBA, a law degree, and a long track record in both business ownership and association leadership, Trevor brings a unique perspective on how structure and innovation can and must coexist. Today, we'll talk about the challenges BC realtors face, how climate change is impacting the housing market, and what the British Columbia Real Estate Association is doing to educate and equip agents across the province for a new era in real estate. Whether you're an agent, broker, policymaker, or just someone fascinated by how industries evolve, this is an episode you want to miss. And Trevor, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really honored to have you on the show. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. 198th episode. You've been at this for a while. I commend you for that. You're sticking to it. Yeah, you did a great job with that introduction. I appreciate that. I've been in, I think the focus for this, considering the audience and what you want to talk about, the focus is the real estate path. And so I've worn many hats within the real estate ecosystem in Canada over the last 20 years. I'm Canadian through and through. I don't have a global footprint. I've lived in 5 provinces and a territory in Canada, from East Coast to West Coast and up north. And I think as we go into the conversation, people will get a sense of my path through the real estate sector. So I won't do a deep dive there, but I do have the experience from a realtor perspective, a broker perspective. I was the chair of a regulator, so from a policy perspective, as you pointed out, and then running a couple of MLSs before I found myself at the BC Real Estate Association, which is more an advocacy group on behalf of the 26,000 plus realtors that we have in British Columbia, Canada.
First question, your first touch point with real estate, what motivated you to jump into real estate?
Originally, it was my father-in-law. My wife and I were living in Edmonton. Our daughter came along. She grew up in Saskatchewan, and we had both been to school in Saskatchewan, another province in Canada. And there was a lot of motivation to get back closer to family, as our daughter was in her early years. And my father-in-law was in real estate at the time. I was intrigued. I got my license and I started as a realtor with a franchise. 2 years later, bought my first brokerage. I was really more intrigued as soon as I was in with the business side of things. And then as that evolved, I got more intrigued with the leadership side of things and got involved with the Real Estate Commission, the regulatory organization. And so it was not quick. It was quick that I found myself not super excited about residential real estate. So right away, I got into commercial and property management. I started a property management company. But then even that, I lasted 13 years with my own brokerages and focused on the commercial side. And it really just was there was almost a visceral reaction when my phone would ring. I just fell out of favor with that aspect of real estate. But I loved the industry. I loved the idea of it. I loved having impact in this sector. And so that's where, through a physical geographic move to British Columbia with my family, I found myself the CEO of a real estate board, more on the MLS side. And so that was that path I'm truly thankful for, that the doors opened at the right times in my progression, that I've been able to stay in an industry for 20 years and continue to have an impact, but also to feel like I'm getting the fulfillment I need in order to stay in the sector and be motivated by it.
You yourself, you're in Vancouver, or you are in the...
Yeah, I'm in Vancouver now. Moved to Vancouver in 2022. Yeah, so been here for just over 3 years in this role as the CEO of the BC Real Estate Association.
How is the market right now in Vancouver? Is it a seller's market, buyer's market? And what can we imagine there?
Yeah, when you talk specifically about Vancouver, it's definitely quiet and arguably a buyer's market. Certainly, there's a lot of inventory, there's a lot of option. Things aren't moving quickly. People have time to do due diligence and make sure they're making the right choice for them. In other pockets of British Columbia, other jurisdictions, we're starting to see a little bit more activity. We're starting to approach sales volumes that are indicative of our 10-year average. But overall, like there's this question of the uncertainty that's created with the geopolitical environment, with tariffs. I don't know how much of your global audience is following the tariff conversation. I know it's impacting a lot of countries around the world, the tariff conversation with the United States, but it really impacts us as sharing a border and having a lot of commonality and a lot of economic cross-border engagement. And so that uncertainty, it filters down to the average consumer, to how much they want to pull the trigger when there might be uncertainty of the economic environment in their community or their province, but also for them specifically with job security and those kinds of things. So the question that's being put to the markets is when will that uncertainty move along enough for people to start to pull the trigger? And we know there's buyers out there. We know there's certainly appetite. It's just waiting for the right time to be able to pull that trigger. And so I don't know how your crystal ball has been working lately, but the economists around here it's really tough to pinpoint that and do any forecasting when there's zero certainty coming out of the United States.
Have the prices therefore also fallen a lot and a lot of things on discount, so there are bargains?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that would be what one would expect, is that the market would start to respond and create an environment that would incentivize buyers to come off the sidelines. But we're not seeing that. We're not seeing a price reduction to the extent that is motivating buyers to jump into that uncertainty. So it's really the price points are holding, but buyers are out there, but listings are sitting for the most part.
Let's talk BC Real Estate Association. Why do associations exist in general?
Yeah, it's interesting. You and I were chatting a little bit before we started, before you hit record, and I think there's the historical aspect of it and I think so many groups are guilty of this. Realtors, brokers, in the real estate context, associations, real estate boards, but even in the broader context of business, is having a hard time of intentionally evolving value proposition. So what happens is the value proposition of a realtor has changed over the last 100 years since the existence of the terminology realtor or thereabouts. But what happens is that value proposition changes with resistance. It changes as a result of having to. It changes as a result of the consumer expectation or the introduction of technology. And all of that is fine. Like that's what evolved, that makes things evolve. People have to change. They have to change but I think in today's context, what I'm inspired to do is start talking about, what does the value proposition look like for realtors 5 years from now? What does the value proposition of real estate boards and associations look like 5 years from now? Because if we're not having that vision, it's going to be really tough to get there involuntarily, right? And maybe it won't be the right place. It won't be the right value proposition that continues for realtors to be able to add value. And I think there's no question to me that the future of the real estate transaction will have a human being associated with it. I truly believe that. There's too much human interaction for that not to be the case. The question is, will that human being be a realtor? Will it be under the structure that we see today? So to go back to your question, the value proposition of the real estate boards and associations has also evolved with the introduction of databases, going from catalogs and sitting down across the table from each other. Like, the boards and associations were really initially created in order to bring together listings and provide a centralized spot for realtors to be able to create this cooperative environment. And then it quickly evolved into, now that we're all working together, the board or association can start to be our voice to advocate to government around policy changes related to housing or regulatory changes that affect the industry and the way I do my business. And so then it became this voice, this advocacy component. And then boards and associations, whether it was because they saw gaps and they saw opportunities to really up the game for realtors and licensees, registrants in their jurisdiction, or whether it was opportunistic, that it was another business stream or vertical integration, they started getting into training and education and professional development. So the value proposition has continued to evolve. And I think there's certainly a conversation, a broader conversation about, have they gone too far? Have boards and associations started to encroach on other players in the sector? Where are the limitations of what their expertise and their capabilities are? We've certainly moved into more of a technological environment around MLSs and bringing all the listings together and creating systems that invite the consumer to see more of the listing information as they're shopping for their needs. So where we're at as the BC Real Estate Association is we constantly do a pressure test of, are we moving down the right path? Are we making the right decisions so that we have buy-in from our stakeholders and we're not constantly trying to justify our existence? When I took this role 3 years ago, one of the first questions I asked of the team internally, the board of directors, other stakeholders is, if BCREA disappeared tomorrow, if we didn't exist tomorrow, how long would it take for anybody to notice? What is our immediate value proposition to the sector? And the response to that, my response to that is, it doesn't really matter if they notice that we're gone tomorrow. It's, what is the bigger impact that we're having and the longevity over time to improve professionalism, the integrity of realtors and how they do their jobs, the access to resources and information that they need in order to better do their jobs and serve their clients, the connectivity, really connecting all of the communities around us and making sure that boards understand what the needs of other boards are and of the realtors in other regions, the regulator and government, how that is impacting industry and making sure they're making the decisions based on information and data that we have as an industry rather than just fighting them on everything. So our existence is really ingrained in kind of all aspects of the real estate ecosystem, but we focus on advocacy, professional development for realtors, our economics arm, which really does analysis, market analysis, and that kind of thing. And then this support initiative through providing contracts and supporting brokers, a linchpin of the industry in our jurisdiction, and just making sure people have the resources that they need.
I interpret this one that it's not mandatory to be member of the real estate association in order to execute the profession of a real estate agent. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I joke that if somebody stood at a whiteboard and said, what would the best environment look like? I'm going to sketch out what the ecosystem would look like that would be most efficient. And what we have today probably wouldn't be exactly what they sketch. But over time, the legacy systems, and as things evolved, where we landed and where we are today is that in British Columbia, and I speak specifically to our jurisdiction because it changes across Canada and certainly globally. In British Columbia, all realtors are licensees, but not all licensees are realtors. So in order to be a realtor and to carry that flag, you have to be part of a local board, which is part of the provincial association, which is part of the national association, who own the realtor trademark. To trade real estate, you need a license, and that's issued by the regulator in the province, the BC Financial Services Authority. They give the authority to somebody to act as a real estate agent or a licensee. And then the other spin on that, something that's unique, I think, to British Columbia, or not as widely the case, is that at the BC Real Estate Association, we actually only have 8 direct members based on our bylaws, and that's the real estate boards in the province. The realtors belong to the real estate boards. The boards are the members of the BC Real Estate Association, and then we're all collectively part of the Canadian Real Estate Association, the national body.
To get an overview, what's the coverage there, the market penetration of all real estate agents
Yeah,
in Canada and then being like in the association / all the boards accumulated?
it's a good question. So what I can say in British Columbia, there's 26,000, just over 26,000, 26,400, let's say, realtors, and about 29,000, just over 29,000 licensees. So the majority of the folks who have a license in British Columbia are realtors. They're part of an MLS system, they're part of the cooperative environment and all of that kind of stuff. In Canada, there's 160,000-ish realtors. The question of how many licensees, I actually don't know off the top of my head. Ontario is definitely the hub of all of that. Folks around the world would know Toronto, capital city of Ontario, certainly the hub of population for the country. They have about, I think Ontario has just shy of 100,000 realtors. I don't know how many licensees they'd have. It'd be north of that, obviously.
It might be for you like a mundane question, but I'm asking because just for you to share some figures. In Germany, it's around, I think, 70,000 agents versus 6,000 at the association. So we have like around like 8% of
Right.
coverage there because
Right.
you just go to the Chamber of Commerce, get your paper, need to show like
Yes.
police certificate that you didn't do any
Yeah.
harm whatsoever,
Yeah.
and then you can
Criminal record
execute
check.
it.
Yeah.
And therefore, I don't want to say that there's a lot of bad fish in Germany, but of course, there's no regulation. And I also talked to Ali Salarian from Toronto a couple of weeks ago, and he said Canada is doing a very good job because it's actually as easy as buying a car because everything goes with certain processes. Do you agree, or do you think, yes, it's true, but let's also play devil's advocate and see what can we actually maybe improve and where is still like some room where you as a CEO of a real estate association could go and say, hey, you talk to the politicians, you try to get a mandate there or a policy issued and say, listen, we definitely need to improve X, Y, Z. What's the discussion you're having there?
So I'm gonna talk to two different points. So one is around less around what you're talking about, I think, and more kind of the greater ecosystem related to real estate development. So getting housing built in Canada. And one of the big policy issues that we're talking about, that everybody's talking about, is reducing the red tape. And there is not even a fine line. There is definitely a line, a definitive line between an open, quote unquote, Wild West environment of just letting things happen and then a regulated kind of environment to ensure safety and to ensure things are credible and to ensure people are protected and the financial investment is protected and all of those types of things, especially in today's world with all of the challenges and risks that associate with all of that. And that's the balance. That is the fine line that everybody's trying to walk. Municipalities have over red taped the opportunity for people to come in, developers to come in and actually put a shovel in the ground and start construction on a property. And all of that red tape costs money. It costs money because of time, carrying financing for longer periods of time before they can actually get revenue from the selling, the final sale of a product, but also the actual financial burden that is placed on having to enforce regulations and having to hire people that know what the regulations mean and how to make people comply. So there's an extra cost with all of that that trickles down to the eventual buyer, and that impacts home prices, it impacts affordability, all of that kind of stuff. On the other, so that's one aspect of our advocacy, our policy advocacy. On the other side of our advocacy is the regulatory advocacy, the environment that licensees and realtors have to comply with as they navigate the conversation of a buyer purchasing a home from a seller. And this is probably more the environment that your other guest was talking about, is trying to keep it as simple as buying another product, but it is a much different conversation. It's a much different experience and expectation and risk exposure and profile for the buyer, for the seller, for all of those anybody else that's involved. When you got large amounts of money moving in a cyber environment, all of the risk starts to compound. And so what we've seen, and I always joke that anybody that's been in the real estate sector in British Columbia for the last 30 years likes to talk about the time when the contract was 2 pages And all it was 2 pages. And now you're talking a 30-page environment going through disclosures, making sure buyers and sellers understand what their obligations are, what the risks are, how to mitigate those risks, what the responsibilities of the representative are, what the agency relationship is. All of those things start to come into the conversation where they never did. It used to be, how much will you pay and when do you want to buy it? And so all of the, and now we've got anti-money laundering regulatory requirements for licensees and realtors across the country. So all of that starts to compound the expectation of knowledge of the licensee or realtor, but it also compounds the potential confusion for not just the realtor, but the client. Now you've got myriads of documents, you've got legalese, you've got all of these expectations. And by the end of a 3-hour session, the 70-year-old couple who just want to get rid of their house so they can move into the little condo that they're waiting on, they're done with all of the contractual requirements. And really, how much did they retain? How much did they understand? So there's a balance that this is one of the things on our roadmap in the next little while, is starting to have different conversations around what does that balance look like? How do we still protect the consumer? How do we empower the licensee or the realtor to be able to have that conversation and know that they're having the conversation credibly, while minimizing the amount of confusion and the amount of oversight that is going to pull back from the benefit of having a regulated environment?
This goes actually into agent development and the professionalism of allowing agents to develop their skills, because obviously you have on the one hand like the result, it's like a symptom of a boring session and everyone just hates to be in that room because everyone just wants to have it done. And then on the other hand, you have potentially a very skilled agent who is not only knowledgeable, but also able to convey the most important information as digestible as possible. How do you, as an association, ensure that this agent development is basically carried out in a very professional way and streamlined, so that you can say it's very coherent? We are very sure that, let's say, the standard deviation is not very high between the worst agent who just didn't take care of the exams and then the high achiever. What's the process there?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, you're always going to have definitely a definitive and even potentially measurable difference on that spectrum, right? The people who are out there always trying to stay on top of things, they're actually reading the emails from us and from the regulator and knowing what the changes are and what the expectations are, versus those that aren't. And even on that sliding scale, on that spectrum, you have agents who are doing deals frequently. So they're constantly involved in seeing the changes. And it's like anything else. When you log into an app that you need to use every 2 years, when you file your taxes once a year, when you go back in the next year, you don't necessarily remember all of those things. You're not able to recognize the changes. So there's an aspect of frequency, right? And the folks who are more involved and doing more frequent transactions will see those changes and be able to adapt. From an education perspective, we're actually in a unique position in British Columbia where we have a requirement over the licensing cycle, the 2-year licensing cycle of a realtor. They're also required to take 18 hours of education or professional development through or the local real estate board. And so that becomes, to your question, that's on us to make sure that we're evolving the education, that it goes this kind of concept of value proposition. And as it evolves, we need to make sure that we're adapting and evolving what our deliveries are so that it makes sense in the day and it's not relevant for 10 years ago. And so what happens is, if we're not evolving what we're providing and keeping it up to date, both from content, but also from what is impacting realtors and their clients today, then the realtors get to the point where they're like, oh, I took that course already 2 years ago, I won't take it again. And if that catalog stays small, then it doesn't take long to have gone through all the courses. They're not relevant anymore. So that onus is as much on us. Now, I think the other piece of this is to create a culture of learning, to create a culture of, I get it. You've been in the industry for 30 years. You've experienced a lot. There's no question. You've done your transactions. You've represented a lot of people. You've seen challenging negotiations and transactions. You've seen very straightforward negotiations and transactions. You've worked with really difficult clients. You've worked with great clients. You've had all these experiences that kind of create who you are today. But that doesn't mean there's not an opportunity to better understand the changes that are happening in today's world and not be stuck on what you've learned over the last 30 years. And so there's those two components, and we really try to do that. Some of it has to be a forced environment. They're required to take those 18 hours. That creates a culture of learning just by virtue of they have to, in order to maintain the benefit and the privilege of holding up the realtor flag. That comes with it. But then there's the value proposition from our perspective. We don't want to do it just for the sake of doing it and making it mandatory. We want to do it because it adds value, because it increases professionalism, because it creates a better experience for the client at the end of the day.
Let's talk technology. Do you also have components in the courses to exactly like maybe target someone who's been in the business for 30 to 40 years and say, listen, we know we don't need to tell you like about all the experience and whatsoever, but actually you can come to us and we give you like some knowledge, skills, expertise, ins and outs, the basics, but to even advanced ways. And then we talk even maybe AI. Everyone talks right now about AI and stuff. So is anything, and if so, where do you also see the evolution going regarding technology?
So on our professional development side, we haven't developed anything specific to technology. There's, again, this kind of collective ecosystem that we're extremely aware of. And I think some of that comes from me having been in all the other roles. There is a value proposition and a role for the brokerage or the franchise to play. There is a role for the local board involved with the MLS and kind of more of the technological components that the realtor interacts with every day. There's training and updating that has to happen around that. So we really try to stay on more of the practice agency, anything to do with the business side of it. That said, I say this a lot, and I don't know if people would find this controversial, if people would agree, and they don't need to. I'm always open to conversations around any of the things I say. But I believe that the boards and associations are not technology companies. And I also believe that they shouldn't be technology companies. They are service delivery companies. And it's how do we package and leverage all of the technology, all of the opportunities out there to empower the realtor to do the best job that they can, and remembering that in our case, 26,000, we represent 26,000 small business owners. They're trying to run a business. They're trying to run it efficiently. They're trying to find opportunities for economies of scale. They're trying to find opportunities for vertical integration, for expansion of service, all of those kinds of things. So how can we best empower them to leverage all of the things out there? So for us, it's not as much about training realtors on technology. We leave that to other stakeholders, but it's how do we make sure that we're leveraging technology to the best of our abilities so that as things evolve, we can become more efficient, we can become more service oriented, and provide an experience that realtors might see the technology being used and know that there's other options and there's other ideas out there. Now, because real estate boards have been around in Canada, they've been around over 100 years. We've evolved from people sitting around tables talking about the listings that they have or the opportunities into catalogs that were printed and distributed by the boards, into databases that realtors or boards could come in and look at the local office. And that got transitioned into what we see today, where the data is more interactive. It's out there for the consumer to interact with. All of that technological evolution required some adaptation by not just the boards, but the realtors themselves. Now we're in an environment where we're seeing that again. What is the impact of AI? What is the impact of large language models, generative AI, and how is that going to not just change the experience of the consumer with the realtor, but the realtor's experience with the MLS and the MLS's experience with their databases and their providers. And there's a bigger conversation too, I think, around how all of this is going to start to empower consumers to ask different questions of models that are out there that become more adaptive to the data that we used to have internally and we were able to protect in our little ecosystem. If realtors, 170,000 of them in Canada, 1.5 million of them in the United States, and however many around the world, start to take information from these MLSs and feed it into generating large language models and ask questions, that data starts to become a lot more diluted. It starts to become a lot more exposed to a larger ecosystem. And I think as we talk about leveraging technology internally, we also need to have bigger conversations as leadership in this industry about what does the future look like? What does the future value proposition look like for our organizations and for the MLSs as this stuff becomes more exposed, whether it's data or services or the actual value proposition of the realtors. And that's where I think looking at this 3 to 5 years, I'm not talking 10 years. Like, I think the days of looking at 10 years from now are long gone. You and I, neither of us can start to predict. When we know that quantum might be 18 to 24 months from now, who knows what 10 years, but what we can do is say 3 years from now, how much will that value proposition change and how do we adapt to achieve it if that's what we see it being?
You have an LLM, MBA, and also deep entrepreneurial roots. What's your next step? You, Trevor Koot.
That's a good question. I don't know that I'm a lifelong learner. I believe in it. I believe in, and not just structured or education, like not obviously that's the route that I've taken. But I think the idea of curiosity, the idea of going into the world every day and saying, not thinking that I know all the things and not thinking that I have all the answers. Certainly, decision making in a leadership role only becomes difficult if you're making those decisions without the information that you need in order to make a good decision. If you are curious, if you find out, you make sure that you're informed and there's enough data to underpin the decision that you're making, then those decisions become easier. And I think that curiosity can be ingrained and can be cultural and can start to feed out from in how others around you start to do their jobs and how they make decisions in their daily lives. And you've emphasized the education, MBA and LLM. I've got an undergrad as well. All of that is really just for me to make sure that I've got the tools in my toolbox that I need to be able to make the decisions that I have in front of me every day. The Masters of Law, the LLM, which now gets confused with LLMs becoming part of the everyday lexicon, but it's a Master of Laws. The one thing that I learned from getting a Master of Laws is that I know absolutely nothing about law. And it's actually really just empowered me to say, if ever there's a decision to be made, I need to hire a lawyer because I am not one and I don't know enough about it. What's next for me? In the early part of this conversation, I was talking about the pleasure, the privilege that I've had to continue to be in various roles within this industry that challenged me and give me fulfillment because I like to be challenged. I love looking at a vision and how can we move towards that? What is my role in driving us in that direction? And for me right now, it's where I am. We have a lot of things on our plate at the BC Real Estate Association. I see a lot of opportunity for impact in this industry. And I want to continue to be one of the thought leaders along with my colleagues to really drive some change and adapt, figure out what that next value proposition is for this industry, because consumers are going to need somebody to help them along with this, with real estate transactions. And I see us being a linchpin in that.
Trevor, thank you so much for the conversation today. I learned a lot. You gave us a nice overview, first and foremost, about British Columbia, the real estate market. You really educated us about the British Columbia Real Estate Association, also along the underlying boards, its mission, the execution, and also the way it ensures high professionalism among all the real estate agents which are associated. You also gave us a very nice overview of where you think the market will go. And you concluded with also your personal touch regarding lifelong learning and going to the next steps. How can people reach out to you if they're curious to get in contact with you?
LinkedIn is probably the best way. I'm very responsive on LinkedIn, but certainly, like from a more professional perspective, my emails on the BC Real Estate Association website. It's pretty straightforward. tkoot, bcrea.bc.ca.
Perfect. I'll put that into the show notes. Thank you so much. Best regards to Vancouver, British Columbia, and a big hug. Thank you so much.
Thanks for this, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
This video is brought to you by HalloCasa. Our tool transforms independent local real estate agents to global real estate agents. Create your own profile for free and get contacted by international investors. Sign up with the link in the description.